Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. A remarkable day at Spa, one of the worst sprints you could ever wish to see, followed up by a banger qualifying session. Lando Norris with a big statement today, taking pole position over Oscar Piastri, especially after what happened yesterday in sprint qualifying. One of the Ferraris finds himself third on the grid, but it certainly was not Lewis Hamilton. Big frustration out of his side of the garage today after a terrible sprint, and then followed up by another mistake in the qualifying session. What is going on over there after the changes that Hamilton says they've made to the car for this weekend that have been on Charles Leclerc's car for quite some time recently? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Big thanks for 81,000 subscribers as well. Believe we hit that a few days ago. Let's start with the sprint because it was all going on certainly in the Alpine garage. Franco Colapinto started in the pit lane because of changes again made under Parc Fermé. They threw him on the softs. Like at the end of the day when you qualified where Colapinto did for the sprints, it's all about trying to get as much data as you can. And the sprint today caused lots of controversy in various ways, and we'll get into why in a second. Today was dry. Tomorrow is still set to rain. This is the current forecast. Tomorrow looks like during race time, which is I think 3 p.m. local time, it's looking like rain is going to play a part. Now, is that good or is that bad? Many would watch the sprint today and say, well, we need something to actually make the race interesting, which is true. But as we know, rain around Spa isn't always the best thing for racing necessarily because it's kind of a dangerous track sometimes. And the FIA is often very willing to put procedures in place to prevent drivers racing in those conditions. So we'll see how it goes. But I do think that it's important to actually switch things up going into tomorrow because today's sprint was absolutely horrific in most ways, and we'll get into why and how in a second. Now, unfortunately for Alpine, their other man was also in the mud. Gasly's car had a water leak issue on his reconnaissance lap to the grid, and unfortunately they had to bring it into the garage and he wasn't able to start the race. Gasly qualified very well. He was actually P8 going into the sprint. He did get to race, but he came out 2 laps behind everybody else and just drove around at the back, basically collecting data for qualifying and the race to come. So not what Alpine would have wanted. A clown show there as ever. But let's talk about the sprint because, oh wow, this was electric, right? Well, it was electric for a couple of corners. Now, this was the race start. Everyone got a pretty solid start. Piastri got a decent start. Max got a good start. Interestingly enough, Max's start was pretty solid, but his run into turn 1 was actually not that good. And I did think when Piastri was probably like 4 or so tenths ahead of Max going out of La Source, I thought, you know what, maybe there's a chance here that he can stay ahead of Max into Le Combe. But no, that was not the case at all. We knew that Max had the higher straight line speed. He was running less wing on the car. And Piastri just got eaten alive going into Le Combe. And so did Lando Norris, right, by Charles Leclerc, who made a great move around the outside as well. Both McLarens found themselves on the inside trying to defend, and both of them lost the position to the respective cars. Great move from Max. I don't think Oscar could have done anything differently with the setup that he had. I think McLaren recognised that losing the lead into Le Combe was an absolute likely possibility. They just thought they would have enough pace to get it back. But as it turned out in the middle sector, it was just too much of a challenge to get close to Max. Certainly Piastri found that, and even though there was some strange discussion that, oh, Piastri's just biding his time, it's like, no, obviously not. Piastri's going to go for the lead if he can. You don't want to be stuck in dirty air 6 tenths behind the car in front of you. And just a phenomenal execution from Max, but also from Red Bull, to be fair to them, right? They chose the setup, they ran lower downforce than they certainly could have done. They turned up to qualifying with a car that wasn't maybe going to be as fast as Piastri's because it was losing time in the middle sector, but recognising that in the race, if Max executed as he needed to, which of course he ended up doing, they had a great chance of doing some damage. So the race gets underway, and if you look at the positions here in the second lap of the race, and you compare them to the positions at the end of the race, they're basically the same. There were some moves that happened. Hamilton made a pass on Hülkenberg. He made a nice pass on Albon towards the end, but basically nothing happened, right? Russell was stuck in a big DRS train. Everyone was stuck in a big DRS train. And I really just wanted to comment, as well as, you know, Ferrari and the drama going on over there right now. It's certainly continued later in the day as well. On this sprint, the concept of a sprint and what it means to do it around Spa, right? Because nobody would watch today's race and be like, wow, that was exciting. It was basically Suzuka, what we saw earlier this season, but in Europe. And there is a real feeling that, yeah, Suzuka and Spa, phenomenal tracks. Nobody's denying that. But for these iteration of Formula 1 cars, it's relatively rare that they actually produce good racing, given the quantity of the dirt here. And I think even some of the track, you know, the way that it's designed, the fact that Le Combe is not like a super heavy braking zone at the end of the Kemmel Straight, I think also does contribute. They did also, as we know, play around with the length of the DRS zone down the Kemmel Straight, and they've shortened it somewhat in recent years because they felt it was too easy to overtake. Well, today it was exactly the opposite, and it was basically impossible to overtake there. Piastri, even when Max made a mistake, like he made not a big error, but it was definitely an error going into the bus stop chicane, went in a bit deep, lost a couple of tenths. Piastri went into La Source like 4 tenths back, and he still wasn't even in position to challenge, right? Like he wasn't even, and yeah, McLaren ran too much downforce in hindsight, and Max had it covered, but like, yeah, Max did a great job, but it's not like anyone was able to overtake. Like, Behrman was getting attacked by Hadjar, and I'm sure that he was defending well, but it's not like he had much difficulty doing so. Just the layout of everything today. I mean, this was the gap, right? This was Oscar 6 tenths back, like Lando was a bit further back than that, but even with DRS and the slipstream and everything, Max was never really under an awful lot of pressure, and that's pretty interesting to look at in hindsight, right? Like, nobody watched this race and was particularly enthralled. You can look at some of the gaps here in the field, and, you know, there was a big DRS train going on, and even where there wasn't a DRS train, it still proved basically impossible to overtake. So, look, last year's race at Spa was good. Nobody's denying that. But you've got to look back at the last decade of Grand Prix at Spa and say that on many an occasion, they've not been especially, you know, whelming, let's say overwhelming. This race was definitely underwhelming given the prospects, and yeah, there was a three-way battle for the win, but it was very clear that unless Max made a big mistake, there was no way he was going to be able to be stopped because, you know, he had it covered. The McLarens were clearly way faster, but they weren't able to overtake due to dirty air and Max getting good drive and having very high straight line speeds. So it was an absolute snooze fest, and I think there's got to be some comments about whether sprints need to just die, which is still an argument that I might make, or whether around Spa we just shouldn't be doing sprints, which I think is maybe the argument here to make. Now, there was talk about Oscar's wing being less loaded than Lando, so Lando had a bit more of an edge once he eventually got back past Charles Leclerc, and Leclerc was in absolute no man's land as well, and that would have been frustrating for Ferrari because, you know, they just weren't able to get close. Verstappen's pace, of course, was good, but, like, clearly the McLarens had more pace if they'd have been able to unleash it, and Leclerc still couldn't keep up with Max. This is when he struggled with the braking issue into the final corner, but he still managed to stay ahead, and at this point it was basically race over. So yeah, Norris was maybe having a chance to attack Oscar, and to be fair to Lando, like, he won't mind the sprint result too much because it means that he only lost 1 point at the end of the day. Hamilton was again struggling heavily with that Ferrari, right? As he says, the car won't turn at turn 1, losing the rears already, and Charles Leclerc also had a terrible time. He came on the radio to say, just tell me when it's the last lap. Like, his engineer was on the radio telling him, like, giving him suggestions, but like, okay, try this, try that. And Charles was like, I'm not bothered, tell me when it's the last lap. And I think that the issues in the sprint today were exacerbated by the fact that it was a sprint. The drivers don't want to take any risk. They don't want to damage the car for qualifying, right? So they don't take risk, and they would much prefer not to do anything, take it very easy into turn 1, make sure they don't do anything stupid. Like, Lando was happy to yield position at Le Comte to Charles because he knew that he would get him back, and then at that point it's like, okay, third or second, you know, either way is probably fine for the championship. So I just think the sprint and the conditions today, and even, you know, Spa's an amazing legendary circuit, like, nobody's denying that, and it is phenomenal in so many ways. But is it great for this iteration of Formula 1 cars? Like, I don't think it's great. It's not Silverstone, in my opinion. You know, it's not Interlagos, maybe. Maybe that's a hot take, and I know that it's kind of blasphemous to say, but, like, I do think that there are some considerations that should be made here to make Spa more entertaining of a racing circuit, if you look at some of the races over the last decade. And on the final lap, this is basically just how things ended. Ocon did a great job. I mean, there was a handful of points that Haas scored with Ocon and Behrman. Sainz did well to hold on to 6th. Maybe there was a chance of him to, you know, people were saying, oh, he's maybe going to get Ocon and get 5th in a Williams, but, you know, overtaking was just not going to happen. So lots of comments from the Ferrari guys, really. As we know, an interesting day for them, for the very least. As Hamilton says, look, learned a lot about the upgrades. Part of the upgrade that Charles had, this is very interesting, part of the upgrade that Charles had since Montreal, and you saw the crash that he had there, and was similar to something that I had yesterday. So it's just about fine-tuning it. Yesterday was the first time running it for me, and I think it's now about fine-tuning it. We can make some changes between now and qualifying. So Hamilton Hamilton's saying that an upgrade that Charles had on the car back in Montreal, which as we know is quite a while ago now, like that's many Grand Prix ago, they brought some change to his car, and we know the crash that Charles had during, well, it was after basically like turn 4 or 5, whatever it is, when he crashed at the little right left-hander, although the right left-hander doesn't say much about Canada because that's all that track is, but he crashed there as we know, and it affected his weekend. He crashed in practice and it affected his weekend pretty massively. Now, Hamilton says that that upgrade or that change only just arrived on his car, which is strange. I don't know whether it's because they would have had it ready. Surely they would have, whatever change it was, surely they would have had it ready. Maybe the team just told him, hey, you know, maybe Hamilton said before he didn't want the change because maybe it wasn't like a big change, like in terms of an upgrade package performance-wise, but now they've brought the new changes, they've kind of told Hamilton, hey, we're going to run this on the car now, and, well, it's obviously not worked out, whatever he's talking about. You know, he goes on to say, we've got a new component in the car that Charles had the first time that I tried it, and it was my first run with it, and maybe that's what caused the rears to snap up in qualifying yesterday. Of course, today in qualifying, it was a rather different issue, and as Hamilton says, not too much to analyse out of the sprint, because we were just in a DRS train. Mine was not optimised, we saw that in the results. Grateful for everyone in the factory, because even Charles Leclerc did say that the upgrades actually worked, which is kind of concerning, right? I mean, that's what Charles said. He's like, yeah, our upgrades worked, but McLaren also brought upgrades, which we know, and they're now even better. So they're 3-4 tenths behind every lap. They want to make up that distance in the race, but it doesn't look especially likely. And Leclerc even says, I don't think there's anything in the car that makes us hope that we can fight with Red Bull or McLaren. So that probably tells you everything you've got to know. So next up was qualifying, and they confirmed that Yuki Tsunoda would have the new floor. Now, it's been a little bit of time since Yuki has actually had the upgrades that he wanted on the car. Pretty much, as we understand, since his crash in Imola, he's been behind the curve on upgrades because they've been pushing so hard to get these upgrades ready for Max to at least give him a chance that Yuki's been very much left behind. And maybe there's an element of Laura McKees coming into the team and saying, all right, you know, we've got to get these upgrades for Yuki because I don't want him to be left out to dry. And they found a way to actually get the upgrades for him for qualifying. They couldn't get him for them yesterday in sprint quali, but they could get them for him today. And that's what they did, and we'll see how that worked out for them. Now, tomorrow is still looking rather likely to rain, as we saw, and as a result, they decided to run a much heavier downforce version of the rear wing. They effectively went a similar direction to McLaren because based on what we saw back in Silverstone, if it's going to rain tomorrow, Max cannot get away with that downforce level. He's going to be nowhere. And I think they recognise, Red Bull, that yes, it probably is going to rain. So we can see immediately the higher downforce that he's running in that lower lip of the rear wing. And that's a big deal for the race tomorrow. And it also meant that the other guys had a bit of a chance when it came to matching Max in the first sector. And actually, some of the other drivers, Russell, Leclerc, you know, their downforce came off the car to some degree, and they were putting in 29.7s in the first sector, and we'll see where that put those guys here in a second. But yeah, just a remarkable qualifying session because Spa, it's such a long lap. There are so many different elements to the lap. And this was a crash. Hulkenberg goes into the side of Stroll before everything even gets underway. It was absolute chaos in the pit lane, really. But Q1 gets underway. Hamilton pitted at 1:41.9, which wasn't great at the time, and it was pretty clear that he would have to go out. He would have to go out again in that Ferrari. Historically here, he's done very well at Spa. His record at Spa is sensational, really. Of qualifying race, it's pretty similar across the board, but it does feel like the changes they've made to that Ferrari have been more challenging for Hamilton to cope with than Charles Leclerc so far. And this was early in Q1, but already you start to see a little bit of a picture of that. This was a pretty crucial couple of laps here for Lando Norris, right? Because earlier in the day, it felt like Lando, once the sprint got underway, was actually very close to Piastri. Maybe he would have been faster than Piastri in race pace. Tough to say, but it's not like Piastri was, you know, pulling a gap with Max ahead of him and Norris couldn't catch up to them. He did, and very comfortably at that. Yesterday, Piastri put an incredible lap. It was a 1:40.5, which Lando managed to match today for what was very nearly another track record around this circuit. But yesterday, Norris was 6 tenths off the pace, and that's clearly not all pace, right? This is a great track for Piastri historically. Okay, only a few years, right? And for Lando, it's not so much. But Lando will have felt last night he needed to dive into the data and figure out what he could have done differently. And I think a lot of it was in preparation of the tyres. His outlap yesterday was maybe faster than it should have been. Keeping the tyres in the right window for the entire qualifying lap is a big deal around Spa because it is a rather long lap. And Lando, his first lap here, really proper lap in Q1, was a 1:41 flat, 6 tenths up on Leclerc, and it was very clear at this point that, yeah, Lando is here to come for pole position today, and Piastri put in a lap that was 2 tenths down. So all of a sudden it was like, okay, hang on a second, we actually do have a serious battle on our hands. This was a point where Russell only went P8. Like, Russell went P8 8 tenths off where Lando was, and Antonelli did a lap that was 4 tenths, 3.5 tenths slower than Russell, which is, look, we know how well Russell is driving this season. Antonelli 3.5 tenths away over a lap this long is not where he wants to be, for sure, but it's not terrible. But Mercedes would have expected, given that they won around here last year with what was, a 1-2 at least across the finish line, they would have thought this would have been no issue to get through. But absolutely it was. And Antonelli was very quickly shuffled heavily down the order. And this was remarkable in many ways, right? Because, yeah, Mercedes' pace was just nowhere here. And I think they messed up again in terms of when they set their drivers out. It was clear that yesterday in sprint qualifying, there was amazing track evolution. And it was the same again here, right? Hamilton puts in a decent lap, although we'll get to that in just a second. Behrman was P5, Hadjar was P4, everyone was moving up the order in the final few laps that were coming across the line, and it looked like it was going to be good enough for Hamilton and not good enough, of course, for Kimi Antonelli. But as it turned out, it was not good enough for Hamilton either, and a terrible day for Kimi and Hamilton yesterday, the guys that swapped around at Mercedes, and even worse today, really, as Bono was on the radio saying we've just been bumped, radio silence from Antonelli. And yeah, there's been lots of talk about Antonelli and his performances because he's had a very difficult run of form, but I definitely don't think the car that they are giving him is helping right now. It looks pretty unstable. I don't know, it's interesting for Mercedes. At the start of the season, it looked like it was a relatively solid car, that Mercedes, but the more upgrades they bring to it, the more tricky it seems to get, and I don't think it's helping Antonelli at all as it stands. So he's out in Q1, and so is Lewis Hamilton, because Hamilton's lap time that he did to get through to Q2, which was solid but by no means spectacular, was actually deleted for track limits, and they got him out of Raidillon, which is, we've seen this on occasion, but it's still pretty rare that you get a lap time deletion here. Obviously, if you try and take a bit too much curb, it's possible, and it looks, to be fair, from this screen, it looks very marginal, right? Because you can see where the blue line is and the white line is, but it does look like he's probably out, and I'm sure that in the onboard, the off-board cameras that they looked at, that indeed was the case. So Hamilton was on the radio saying, damn, was that it? So lap time deleted, ended up P16. If he did a slightly better first run, he probably would have got away with it anyway, but that was not the case. And yeah, just a really tricky time for Hamilton. Yesterday, was it his fault? Was it not his fault? Was it an error with the car? We saw Hamilton a few minutes ago talk about a change that they've made on the car that's making it maybe more challenging for him. But it's still crazy. They brought this upgrade, and maybe it has worked. I mean, at the end of the day, Charles Leclerc put in a mega lap at the end of qualifying to at least put Ferrari in with a sniff of a shout. But Hamilton was out in the first part of qualifying, the first time since 2016 that he's not going to start in at least the top 4 at Spa. Another streak that this partnership manages to break. So yeah, just tough times lately for Hamilton and for Ferrari in general. I mean, it's interesting really, because if you look at the most recent Grand Prix, out of the McLaren drivers, Hamilton actually has the highest average finishing position among Leclerc, among Verstappen, among anyone else, Alonso, Albon, like whatever you want to say. Outside of the 2 McLaren guys, Hamilton has the best finishing position over the last few rounds, but it's still not been great. And then, obviously days like today, very challenging indeed. So Hamilton came out and just said, look, anything can happen. Tomorrow it's going to rain, but definitely a weekend to forget. He apologised to the team as well, and he said, look, sorry for the performance. I saw the interview that he did with Sky Sports, I think, and Craig Slater right afterwards, and was like, look, yeah, a couple of mistakes on my side in a row. Obviously, he has his opinions, I'm sure, on yesterday, and maybe it wasn't fully his fault. But this, at the end of the day, he went outside of track limits. There's nothing to do other than apologise and move on a weekend where Ferrari were really hoping to start turning things around. And maybe they have made some progress with that car, but it's just not enough to compete with the McLarens as it stands. These were the first laps that came through. Piastri with a 140.6. Lando was about a tenth or so behind that. Verstappen was a couple of tenths behind that. This is Q2, of course. Piastri wasn't very happy with some of the shenanigans that were continuing there in the pit lane, and the end of Q2 was very dramatic. So Piastri was P1 this time. Verstappen was, pretty much those laps stayed as they were. Tsunoda got through. So, he wasn't insanely fast, but it was big for Yuki today, like a really big day for Yuki, because he was on the verge at a time of going out in Q1. He was on the bubble for a time, and then he put in a solid lap that was good enough to advance him. And yeah, those new Red Bull upgrades that he's finally got on his car seem to maybe be helping him actually deliver some decent performances. Hadjar, Lawson, Bortoletto did a great job again to get through. It was a couple of tenths up on Hulkenberg, so mega performance again from him. Feel bad for Ollie Behrman because Yuki cut him up bad into the bus stop chicane when they started their laps. That meant Behrman's tyres were not in the right window going into the first corner. He lost about 3 tenths in just the first few corners alone, and that would have been the difference between Behrman being P12 and potentially well into Q3, and with a serious chance in a Haas that was looking rather good this weekend. But then Q3 got underway, and Norris put in a 140.5. This is a mega lap. Green, purple, green, right on the money, and it was always really going to be a battle between the two McLaren guys for pole. It was pretty clear that Verstappen was not going to be close enough. I think Leclerc's lap was very, very impressive. To be within 3 tenths, faster than what Verstappen was yesterday, faster than where Verstappen was today. Verstappen will feel like he should have been quicker than that. Again, he lost probably a couple of tenths in just the first. I mean, he did. He lost 2 tenths in Sector 1 based on a big slide out of the source. So Max was pretty close. He actually did a really good lap, but the Sector 1 cost him in the end. And Russell put in a solid lap too. What's kind of hilarious and embarrassing for Mercedes in many ways, as Piastri just went yellow Sector 3, he was about 400ths down on Lando after the second sector, and no one really improved, right? In the second run, nobody really improved. They were all about a tenth off where they wanted to be, mainly because the track was warming up a little bit and the conditions were getting slightly harder. But for Mercedes, there will be questions because Russell was purple Sector 1, purple Sector 3, green Sector 2, and 7 tenths down. Like, the Mercedes was nigh on losing a second in the middle sector, which is, that is shambolic. Like, there's no other way to put it, really. But as qualifying concludes, these were the results. Norris on pole after what happened in qualifying yesterday. For Norris to get down to the same time that Piastri did yesterday and Piastri not to be able to quite replicate that lap, that's big for the Grand Prix. What happens tomorrow in the rain, whether you want to lead out of turn 1, given the run up the hill, it's a good question, but it's probably going to rain. Maybe that's where you want to be if you're Lando. Leclerc does an amazing job, really, I think, to get third, just ahead of Max. Then Albon, P5 in the Williams, was the final man to cross the line. Tsunoda ends up in 7th, which is a big result for him, only a couple of tenths off Max. Hadjar and Lawson made it in there as well, but were out-qualified by Yuki for the first time in a very long time as well. And then Bortoletto was 10th. So very much interested to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.